Hello again. So this session we're going to be starting chapter 15, which concerns production. But before we start, let's set our minds, set our motivation to consider how we want to work to benefit all beings, and we're willing to shoulder the responsibility for that. And the way in which we see the best way in which we can meet the needs of all beings is through Buddhahood, through achieving enlightenment, which frees us from the shackles of the sleep of ignorance and the pain of suffering. And so seeing this as being available to us and able to tread the path is available to us as well. We recognize from the basis of our compassion or our empathy for our family or beings that we can make a difference. And so part of that is to, in our path, is to recognize the 3 higher trainings or the 6 perfections. And within that is to develop in our insight, our understanding that frees us from binding ourselves to samsara, to cyclic existence. So this freedom, this is something that we can use our mind to develop an understanding which frees us from reaching out and grasping, or reaching in and grasping at ourselves in a way which is not appropriate, it's toxic for us, it's a cause of suffering, both to ourselves and to others. So that's what we're doing, is to getting clarity, providing clarity on recognizing the boundaries of what it means to develop our insight. So we still need to practice, we still need to develop our concentration. It's not as if we only can develop enlightenment on insight alone, but it's a very, very powerful benefit to our practice and to our understanding. So there's no need for us to wait until we have developed our calm abiding or our serenity. Instead, we can begin to study it and use it as a part of our development of serenity and the rest of our practice. So production in this particular case is important, and Rinpoche wants to talk clearly about how production is not going to be refuted. So this word refute is coming out a lot now, and refute here means something that is disproved. So it's actually to prove its absence, or to prove to disprove it rather than to prove it. And it's not just merely to show that it cannot be proved, but that it is a disproof. It is not available to us. Now, the way in which the translation has used the word here is refuting in a way which is not necessarily established. So different people talk about, you say you refute this, but we refute your refutation, which in one sense doesn't make much sense, because if you have refuted something, then you have actually established that it's not valid at all. So we have to really look at the idea of dispute. So to dispute something versus to refute something. To dispute something is to say, I believe that there's no evidence for this, but to refute it is to eliminate it as a possibility completely. So I'll see what I can do to keep that clear. And secondly, the other aspect of this primarily is that Rinpoche is going to be, in the first half of this chapter, is going to be discussing what is known as the Chatuskoti, or the Tetralemma. So this is a very old Indian division in logic between how something arises, or in a sense is produced, or how it exists, or its mode of being. And the idea is that one has to select between one of these 4 alternatives. So the idea is it's either it is or it is not, or it both is and is not, or it's neither is nor is not. So these are the sort of the 4 different aspects of what's known as the Tetralemma. Tetralemma is a Greek meaning, the four arguments, basically. So what we're going to do here is the four choices. So we have a dilemma, which is two, it either is or it isn't. And this is a tetralemma, which is it is, isn't, both is and isn't, or neither is nor isn't. And the point here is essentially, while this is a sort of a logical or philosophical framework, it's quite useful for us when we're doing our analysis work. And so this is why it's being introduced. Now, it's nowadays most well known, this method, coming from the Middle Way school, because Nagarjuna used it quite a lot in order to demonstrate how the mode of existence. But it actually predates Nagarjuna quite some way, and in fact there are even some sutras by Buddha 500 years earlier that sort of used the same sort of structures. So we for what we can understand is it's a very old Indian way of bringing things down into some sort of different ways of looking at things. So here I am, and the idea is essentially I'm thinking about saying, well, okay, either something is produced from itself, self-produced, or it's produced from something else, or it's from both itself and something else, or neither itself nor something else. In other words, it's causeless. It's produced causelessly. And yet, what I'm hearing is that that from the Middle Way school, we say that none of these is the basis for production. Therefore, there are two options. Well, either it refutes production, in other words, there is no production at all, or or alternatively, the refutation of these four, or the dispute this using these four different arguments, these four different types of production that are available to us, fails to refute ultimate production, or final production, or objective, or real, essential, inherent. Okay. So Rinpoche says, well, okay, well, it's true that we don't. It's true that we don't think it refutes production. That's our whole point. It refutes inherent production, not or objective, or in the sense ultimate, but it doesn't refute mere or conventional production. So he says, Rinpoche says, let's look at this. So let's imagine that we accept that there is something, that the world is filled with these objects that actually exist on their own, floating around as completely independent things that aren't, really exist there, are actually present, objectively present, like this blue cup. So this blue cup is here and it's wandering, it has its own life, if you like, in the universe, and it exists as an object. Does it? So that's the point. It says, let's imagine that it does. So if we do, when we analyze whether or not it exists, when we use all of our reasoning that's available to us as to whether or not it does exist, then we should be able to find it. And likewise, in terms of the fact that it's here, then we also must use the same sort of methodology for working out whether or not it exists, how it is produced, rather, to say that. So it says, for instance, if we come to that conclusion that things really do exist and are floating around in the universe, they don't have to literally float. I mean, I'm using that as just as a shorthand, but it exists around us in the way that they appear to, then it's definitely true that we would have to find one of these four approaches to how it is that it exists there. However, we don't assert that, because we don't believe that it does float around. We think that it's there in terms of being able to talk about it. It's there within our conventions. We can talk about it as a referent object, but that doesn't mean that we've established it exists on its side. So we see it as arising on particular effects in dependence upon different causes and conditions, and therefore we do not establish true production. It arises from all sorts of causes and conditions. So in one sense, if we were to talk about it, we could say that it arises from a collection of other things, right? But the point about it is that it doesn't arise as an object without being designated. So in that sense, it belongs to a context. It belongs to a context within which it is established. And outside of that context, we can't say that it exists. Because we don't ask for it to be a real thing, we don't imagine it being wandering around on its own, existing in itself, then we don't, why would we sort of think, okay, well, let's establish how it exists through the mode of this sort of analysis? Because we're not asking it in its mere nature to exist in any of those, so we don't expect it to withstand that sort of analysis. And so it's not only that, but if we understand dependent production, how dependent production works in terms of causes and consequences and circumstances and so on, then this itself shows us that the four types of production that we've talked about are invalid. They don't work for the way in which things are. And he says, Chandrakirti mentions this, it says, because things arise dependently, our mistaken conceptions cannot bear scrutiny. Therefore, the reasoning of dependent arising cuts through the entanglements of all bad views. So essentially, once we really understand dependent arising, how dependent arising works, then we're no longer struggling with how something comes into existence like this fist, right? Or is able to hold water, or continues to exist, or ceases to exist. So all of these things cease to be a mystery to us, and we have finished with philosophy. This is one of the aspects about this, which is why I find it difficult to struggle to call the middle way tradition of philosophy, because it ceases these views of things being as one way or another. It doesn't mean that there aren't views held, or if you like, beliefs or understandings held by the middle way school. Of course, there are, and things like saying there are there's no intrinsic existence is one particular strong one. So then Rinpoche is saying, so in terms of this way of thinking, if we think that, well, if we can't see any production from any of the, we can't find the production of the mug or whatever from any of these four alternative ways, then if we then feel, well, in which case, if it doesn't meet any of these criteria, then we have to assume that it doesn't exist. In which case, then we don't understand dependence arising. And he says this is a bit like saying, so that thing which is free from extremes, right? In other words, the extremes of existence or non-existence. This thing that is free from extremes, the cup, the mere cup, which of the four extremes does it belong to? It's like, no, it's free of extremes. It's sort of like, no. There's a misunderstanding of what it means to be something or not to be something in terms of how it is. It exists in a way which is free of extremes, therefore it doesn't belong to any of those four extremes. And he says this particular thought, if we look at it, is rooted in exactly the same position, which is we haven't really distinguished between intrinsic production and production. We're still holding on a little bit to it having some sort of intrinsic, inherent, or essential or objective. Again, these are all synonyms for saying something exists on its own in its own way, floating around in the universe. So then the question is, we can ask ourselves, especially if we're studying these texts, we might think, well, if we read Chandrakirti, he says the argument that shows that production from self and from other are not tenable in the context of ultimate reality, but is also untenable even conventionally. So what does that mean? And Rinpoche is being clear. He says, look, I mean, I think he's saying, look, we can read these texts and we can quite easily feel quite confused by what's going on, but it's not. They're not confusing, really, if we understand what's being said. He says that, so when we start thinking about the idea of not just the object, but the production of that object as being effectively essentially existent or inherently existent, so that not just the object itself, but the production of the object, then these arguments refute it even conventionally, because there is no inherent existence, nothing, not even production or non-production or the cup and so on. So he says it doesn't matter. Essentially, it's just to be clear that what we're doing is we are talking about the inherent existence, that it is not does not withstand analysis. We aren't denying at all, or we're not refuting, or we're not denying anything to do with mere production or conventional production or production arising from dependent arising, because in the same passage that we've just cited Chandrakirti from, he says. And he's now citing another thought that one might have. Things that serve as the causes of the afflicted and pure phenomena must produce substantially existent entities. And the response is, well, if this was so, then the words of your statement would not be present. And why? And they argue is because, and this is the part that we've just talked about, which is the idea that when we talk about something that shows production from self and from other, they are untenable in terms of being able to actually, in terms of not only ultimate reality, but also in terms of intrinsic production being untenable even conventionally. So therefore, what he's saying is, if these things had to produce ultimately existent things, then these words would cease to work, because there is no such thing. And so, and Chandrakirti's own auto-commentary, his own self-commentary on this, says, we must admit, even unwillingly, we have to come to the conclusion that production by way of intrinsic character or intrinsic nature or intrinsic production itself does not and cannot exist in either finally and objectively and ultimately, or even in conventional truth. It's not available to us at all. So one of the aspects of this, which is possibly useful, possibly not, is to recognize that we can still talk about these things, and we can still use stories about these things, and these are fictions. So recognizing the ability to talk about things which are fictional doesn't mean that they're useless. We can learn a lot from a fiction, but that doesn't establish them as being truthful or either conventionally or conventional truths or ultimate truths. So we can talk about something like the objective truth or the objective existence of an elephant, but that doesn't mean that elephant that there is such a thing, or it's even possible for there to be an objective elephant in that sort of way. So often, like, for instance, myths or metaphors or stories or fables or even constructive languages, problem-solving languages, are involve fictions. They, we have the rabbit and the hare and tortoise, having a race, and it's like we know that really is a fiction, but we can learn from it. It has a message to us. So recognizing that fictions can still hold meaning doesn't detract from themselves from being fictions, right? They have, if you like, they hold within them a truth or a potential truth, something that resonates with us, but that doesn't establish that the story itself is true. So this is essentially what Rinpoche is saying is if we fall into the idea of saying that production happens, but the objects don't, the objects under production are not objectively existent, we fall into this problem of having to distinguish between some sort of assumption of reality, of objective reality about production, without necessarily claiming something else, which doesn't really work for us. We either have to accept these things objectively inherently exist and their processes, or they do not. We can't sort of pick and choose this sort of way. And particularly, I mean, and especially following Chandrakirti, is that when we're talking about the existence, in terms of conventional truth, in other words, not fables, but conventions, like the existence of this mug is established, I think. And then we can definitely say that established conventionally, right? So then within that we don't want to we can't even say that it conventionally has an intrinsic truth. This is sort of just missing the point. It doesn't work that way at all. And he says, for instance, if we imagine that something somehow generates from itself, so self arises, then let's say, for instance, a rabbit's horns. Remember, this is one of the standard non-existent objects, is a rabbit's horn. So, if we imagine that a rabbit's horn is non-existent and somehow it self-arises, this just because this is sort of like it doesn't exist, the object exists, it doesn't exist, and the mode of its production doesn't exist, so it just doesn't exist at all. And similarly, when we talk about the idea of objective production or essential production, it exists in exactly the same sort of way, both in our conventions and also in reality. So then we can come down to the conclusion of saying, well, if you're saying that there is no such thing as objective production, it doesn't exist intrinsically, then therefore there cannot be production at all. I mean, what does that mean? What does that look like? How can we talk about conventional production? Obviously there's things are being produced. And therefore, because of this, we have to come to the conclusion that dependent production, dependent arising, and the absence of intrinsic production are contradictory. They don't work together. When we're thinking about dependent arising, how things are arise from causes and effects and circumstances and so on. So all these different ways in which things arise, and essentially this flow, this sort of continual flow of arising and falling, subject to specific causes and circumstances and conditions and so on. And what we're saying is that for us to talk about that, when we start using language like intrinsic production, are we talking about something which is on that side, on the natural side? And the answer is no, we can't say that, because essentially our words, the way our concepts, the very way we see them, is it belongs to conventional truth. And he says if we slip and we think, well, yeah, okay, I get dependent arising, I get the idea, but or dependent production, I get that idea, but it's really happening out there. There really is happening there. He says, and it's like Chandrakirti says, you have no ears and you have no heart. Yeah, and he says, when what do I mean? That is like, because when you hear, this is why you have no ears. When you hear the word intrinsic, when you hear the idea of production, you don't recognize that it needs to be qualified by the distinction between intrinsic and non-intrinsic. So specifically he says, when we're referring to the lack of intrinsic production, it's like you're not hearing. There is no intrinsic production. He says and therefore we say there's no production, not recognizing there's no intrinsic. He says, in terms of saying there's no heart, it means that we don't understand what intrinsic means. And Nagarjuna's 60 verses says, the supreme knower of reality, in other words, Buddha, says that dependent production is not production. So what does he mean here? Is he saying dependent production is not intrinsic production? And when we see dependent arising, this is again a Chandrakirti 60 verses. So he says, when we see dependent arising, we don't perceive things as intrinsic existence. When we really understand dependent arising, there's no space for intrinsic existence at all. And this is because dependently produced is not intrinsically produced. It's like a reflection, but in a sense, the idea is saying we've got to recognize what it is we're establishing and where, and we recognize dependent arising, but it is not it's not qualified until we can recognize that it's non-intrinsic. So then somebody says, is it the case, or is it not the case, that dependently produced is produced? It's just produced. How can you say that it's not produced? If you say that something's not produced, then you should not say that it's dependently produced. Therefore, because these are mutually exclusive, we can't be right. This can't be right. And it's just like the idea of saying, if you're saying it's dependently produced, then that establishes production, right? And here, again, this is Chandrakirti sort of saying, no, look, no, you're sort of slightly missing the point here. Let's be clear, he says. He says, the way it's translated, it says, poor thing. You're still arguing, and puts us in a very difficult, it's a little bit patronizing. So the reason why we find both Je Rinpoche and also Lama Tsong-kha-pa and also Chandrakirti and sometimes Nagarjuna too have a tendency to be a little bit aggressive sometimes is not because they're furious or angry, and this is mainly to do with acquired behavior on a debate courtyard. So when they're discussing these sort of things, and especially when you're using your analysis, there's a tendency to be rather hard and strict. So it's not really, we have to be aware of and empathize with the fact that this is not really appropriate behavior normally, right? But this is completely considered appropriate and fine on the debate courtyard in monastic courtyards. So he's sort of saying, oh, poor you. But let me explain again. He says, so essentially, we're saying that dependently produced things are, like reflections, not produced intrinsically. So like reflections, they depend upon the face to show a face. Similarly, there's the reflection of the face cannot be produced on its own. It doesn't stand on its own. It requires a face in order to be a reflection of the face. Likewise, here we're saying because it depends, because it's arising dependently, therefore they cannot be produced intrinsically. They cannot stand alone. And it's very, very simple in one sense to remember that essentially what we're saying is if something stands alone floating around in the world, it exists independently, right? It's independently existent. It's wandering around on its own in space. So if this exists here on its own, wandering around in space, it exists independently of everything. So therefore, what we're saying is it doesn't do that. We know it depends upon all sorts of circumstances for its arising, for its continuation, and for its fading away, right? So therefore, it doesn't exist independently. Not only but the way in which we perceive it is as if it does exist independently, and this is the point, this is the argument. And again, the way in which we perceive it, in terms of its mode of existence, in terms of the way in the actual object as an object appears to be, belongs to convention, not to nature, right? In terms of nature, in terms of its nature, it's a dependent arising and does not necessarily have the boundaries that we give it to at all. There's just a flow. So we can't, and even then, that flow implies something being present, and we can't talk about it in that way because essentially this is part of the language what we use. Essentially what we're saying is free of any form of intrinsic, inherent, or independent existence. So, and Rinpoche says, we really need to get clear about these distinctions again and again. It's good for us to consider it, to reconsider it, to think about these things and those things and these things and those things. Don't be brave, essentially. Don't be shy, and don't be concerned about whether or not we might disagree with the teachers, or we might disagree with that. We have to be brave. We have to explore for ourselves, find out for ourselves, and try to understand and unpick what these distinctions are very, very clearly. Recognize, like from last session, we were talking about conventional existence. What does that mean? What is a convention? What is conventional existence? How does that work? What are the limits of existence in terms of conventions? They're absolutely relevant to us, because if we can't distinguish what a conventional or mere existence is, then it's going to be very hard for us to be able to differentiate between the assertion of the conventionally existent and the denial of the ultimate or the intrinsically existent. So again, from Sutra, he says, whatever is produced from conditions is not produced inherently. It is not intrinsically produced. Whatever depends upon conditions, I consider, and as a sort of shorthand for causes and conditions, I consider to be empty. One who knows emptiness is diligent. One who understands this is diligent. So Rinpoche then says, some people hear these words and they think that it's saying only the produced is not produced and only the dependent does not depend, and that somehow this way of reading this, so it says whatever is produced is from conditions is not produced. And so we can read this and think, okay, essentially what this is saying is that only the produced is not produced, as if that means something. And he's saying, well, no, it doesn't. If we can easily get ourselves confused, confusion is much easier for us to do, especially when we're doing this sort of analysis, because we don't really, there's a huge amount of us that really doesn't want to know. We want to keep in our bubble of ignorance. We want to look after our cherished inner self, right? So this sort of thing is very easy for us to become confused. It's not the case. It says this is clearly what is being produced from conditions is not inherently produced. So therefore, it's like we're establishing it doesn't mean whatever is produced is not produced. Whatever is only the dependent does not depend, right? This is it's a silly idea. And again, in fact, in the Lankavatara Sutra, cited by Chandrakirti and Prasnapada, he says, Mahamati, thinking that they are not produced intrinsically, I said that all phenomena are not produced. And that then basically answers the question about whether or not we need to qualify with ultimately in these cases, because essentially we can see that actually both in sutra, also in the middle way, often ultimately or as intrinsically are not always established as being it has to be written there for it to be there, especially like many other texts. So up until now, or of the last few sessions, really what we've been doing is establishing essentially that it doesn't matter whether we look at it from perception, or we look at it from argument, or we look at it from sort of logic, or we look at it from rationality. We can't find an angle or that would demonstrate that we require intrinsic existence for things to exist, to merely exist, right? So because of that, we can imagine that dependent arising can work, continue to work. The world can continue to survive without the need for intrinsic existence. So we really need to now identify what that means in terms of what is intrinsic, what is it that we're grasping onto, and the nature of that grasping, as also in terms of the way in which we understand conventional truth or dependent arising, but such that the conventional truth does not leave us with anything to cling on to. That actually, essentially, we don't want something that allows for us to self-grasp, right? Saying I'm precious. So we need to be able to recognize within our own understanding specifically how these two different ways, two different modes of being help us. The ignorant one of believing there to be some sort of intrinsic existence that gives us the ability to grasp, and the recognition of conventional existence which does not give us the ability to grasp. These are the two things we need to work on. And it's an ongoing, it's a sort of a life challenge. It's not necessarily something we're going to understand immediately like this. Sometimes we get a strong insight and it's like life-changing. At that moment is life-changing. But as I've said before, it's sometimes quite upsetting because it's like we've lost something that we've lost something, and we would then begin to recognize, well, we never had it, but it's still a little bit sad. So because we're still grasping quite tightly. So this sort of understanding is going to be something we're working on until also that we can then, it helps us to let go of, to release some of our anguish, some of our fears, some of our fury, some of our desires. And as we do that, then that helps us with our meditation and with our practice. And that allows us to concentrate more deeply and to establish greater insight. So this is not as if we need to just think about doing A, B, C. We also need to look at the way in which these things work together. Like when we tighten on a wheel, we do one nut at a time on a car. Yeah? So we a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, like that. So then somebody says, Well, you know, your idea about the analysis of forms and existence of forms using the four arguments and so on does have actually. You're saying it doesn't bear any aspect of it of whether or not it's true, but in fact it does. And we, us, or I, have this better view of understanding the middle way, where because I don't have a position of my own, then this analysis doesn't apply to me. So this is a misquote from Nagarjuna, and a misunderstanding of Nagarjuna, who wrote something like this in the Madhyamika Karika, which Mula Madhyamika Karika, which we'll talk about later on. I think Rinpoche talks about it in a couple of chapters' time. So that aspect there is something he's added right now because we're going to be going back to it, and he says, yeah, I'll talk about that later on. So these sorts of things there's lots of different ways in which we can imagine that, oh, okay, by holding this position, then I don't need to do that. By holding that position, I don't need to think about this. But we do need to think very carefully about this, not because we're trying to develop or establish a philosophy. We're actually trying to develop an anti-philosophy, if you like, or something that destroys our convictions or our knee-jerk, if you like, reaction to the way in which we see the world. So it's not as if we're necessarily going to arrive at a point where we devalue everything completely, but we will be able to reassess our relationship with everything quite strongly. And this is one of the aspects of that. And as we do so, then we'll also see essentially a lot of what we imagine to be really important issues and not that important at all. So as I said, it's going to be a short session today. I've split this chapter into two groups, one about production and how it's not refuted, or if you like, in terms of it's not disputed. But what we do dispute is ultimate or inherent production intrinsically. So, and then next session, what I'll do is I'll talk about the nature of the intrinsic nature of emptiness, which is what the second half of this chapter is all about, and so it feels sensible really to do this across two sessions. Okay, so mainly this week has been Rinpoche has been establishing how or introducing this fourfold argument, and also he's been really discussing how the fourfold argument, it works when we're using as the object of our analysis something intrinsic, where it's the analysis is not valid to be used against a conventional truth or mere existence, and how in the process one can invalidate, one can demonstrate conclusively that there is no intrinsic production and no intrinsic objects, but we cannot use this analysis to establish or deny mere existence, mere production, or if you like, conventional existence, conventional production. And what we're recognizing again and again is the relationship that Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, and Lama Tsongkhapa have with dependent arising, also known as karma, if you like, but also this all to do with the causes and circumstances, causes and conditions on which things arise, and which things exist, and in which things expire. So this is where we're finding the distinction between insight and ignorance. So it's very, very subtle, but very, very powerful indeed. And it survives many, many arguments, really does. So it's very hard to, in fact, I think would be hard to say that it is possible to refute the viewpoint of the middle way, to actually conclusively reject it through finding a disproof. Whereas nearly every other philosophy, it's easy to point to paradoxes where there are failures in terms of the assumptions underlying, even within some of the mathematics that we have. Okay, so let's try to think about that a bit more, and also to remember that what we're doing this for is to liberate ourselves from our ignorance. This is the only purpose of this. And again, where we should or can continue to be dedicated to working on this, and to recognize that as the basis of our motivation is the suffering of all beings. So it's while we can recognize suffering, and when we can recognize that liberation, enlightenment is available to us, then this is legitimate. Excuse me. It was a path. Okay, so let's sit for a little bit.